That should work if it's just in the middle there. And it's highly open to editing. In fact, it'll be edited to shit. Okay, alright. We'll just take out the gems and splice them together and make it seem like
make ourselves look really
totally
good.
coherent.
Yes.
So, you said it quite a long time ago, and it's come up a few times, and it has stuck with me. When you said that what people think they accept as being sacred because they've thought it. Because it happens, because it's in their thoughts, it's in their heads, they just assume it must be valid in some way or worth listening to and follow it. And it stuck with me because there are so many different voices, and if you're not distinguishing what those voices are and where they're coming from, then you're pretty much at the mercy of anything you think. And quite possibly, a lot of what you think is just is probably not sacred or worthwhile.
Somewhat questionable.
Exactly. And so the thing is, it's a very interesting way to look at things, because if you start to distinguish what those voices are, and we've had discussions before about, and I remember also clearly about you saying almost the day that you can remember hearing your ego actually speaking. Almost, I think the way you described it was kind of like
inner dialogue.
Like an inner dialogue, almost like a radio that was switched on,
yes.
and you could actually distinguish the separate voice in a
yes.
way that was speaking. You could identify it as being the ego or the negative ego in that case. And so it's a really useful way of understanding things, is to understand where those voices or thoughts are coming from. Because there are so many of them, I thought maybe it's a good idea to look at what some of those possible voices or patterns of thinking are.
Okay. Why did it stick with you? What did... because you have mentioned it before, and I'm curious about it. It's fascinating that how did that show up for you as being useful or important?
I guess obviously I must have thought the same at some stage.
Do you have an experience of where you were able to identify a voice that was automated, or maybe not, maybe not what you would identify as you now? Did you have an awakening moment? That was my awakening moment, is when I actually heard a voice and realized that it wasn't me. So
it sounds like a very clear moment for you, but for me it's at times on an ongoing basis now, where I will suddenly recognize a pattern of thinking or a pattern of behaving that has come from obviously a pattern of thinking, and think and I sort of realize that's my mother, that's my father, that's a pattern that's not, it's an inherited pattern.
Yes.
It's that I obviously learnt, and it kicks in as a default, and it's there, and it could be a pattern of self-pity. Or
and you recognize it, and then you
recognize it. Yeah.
I've seen this before, and you look and you go, oh my gosh, this is what one of my primary caregivers did, and then you notice, you don't remember making a decision that you were going to take that on, but then you start noticing a pattern of that. Feels exactly the same as you recognize it as one of your parents.
Yeah.
There's a saying about that. You become an adult when your primary caregivers live in your head. So you don't need them anymore.
Yeah, but that's pretty frightening.
It is kind of frightening, actually.
Because that's not the adult I want to be.
Yeah, I would have to agree. So let's talk about that for a second. So, why is it so important for us to actually be able to, like, why isn't that an adult that we want to be? What's the downside?
I don't think it's a responsible way of being in the world. I think it's a reactive way of being in the world. I think that my parents were reactive to their situations. They did a lot of things by default, which they probably learned from their parents. So if I'm just inheriting those patterns, I'm inheriting my grandparents' patterns, my great-grandparents' patterns. These are patterns that may or may not have been functional 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Certainly not functional for me, and they're certainly not appropriate for me now, because they're conditioned from past events. They're not current. It's not me responding in an appropriate way to what I'm dealing with at this point. It's a conditioned pattern, even if it's 50 years ago.
Yes.
Or 100, or less, 20 years ago. It's completely not useful at this point right now. So that's not the adult I want to be.
I think it was, I really wonder how useful it ever was, but it was common, and that we really didn't look at what, for me, the demarcating, what am I going to say, the demarcating description, or how I would describe where these things come from, is from fear. Is that it's fear-based, and pretty much anything that's along that's my criteria as well. Is that I look at what is the fear, and then I take a look at what the voice is. I take a look at what the content is, and then I go, is this fear-based? And either it is or it isn't. And if it is, then I actually have to look at what that fear is, and decide whether look directly at what am I. The process is what am I protecting? What is it? You can figure out what the fear is one way or another. It's usually fairly obvious to us if we just ask ourselves, so what would be the fear with this pattern, with this thought, with this idea, with this emotion, this motivation that I have? What is the motivation? And when it is fear, I had to decide that I didn't want to be motivated by fear, especially when I found out that if the world is a reflection of what it is that I put out, let's just pretend for a moment that whatever I'm putting out into the world is coming back to me as a reflection of my own thinking, and everybody's experience is different, and what they're putting out is what they're getting back. It's virtually creating your life. There's a saying, is worry is prayer for the things that you don't want. So that's kind of how I was a really easy line to walk, is this fear? Do I believe in this fear? Is this important to me? Is it real? Do I want to be creating this? And ultimately the answers were no and no and no. So it became very easy about, I don't want to live from fear. I don't actually want to be reactive. I don't want my decisions to be made up from fear. So that's maybe pretty far down the line, but how does that make you feel?
No, that makes sense to me, because I tend to think of things in terms of certainly choices. The choices that I make based in, are either fear choices or growth choices. And so in every situation there's an opportunity to react based on a fear attached in some way, or to choose something because it's a growth choice, and it will allow for more expansion and more opportunity to become more of who I really am, as opposed to the fear choices, which are contracting.
So when we come back to, having said that, and having, there's growth choices and there's fear choices, I like that saying, is that how is it being useful to go back a little bit and go, everything that I think is sacred. A lot of people believe that everything that they think is sacred because they're feeling and experiencing it. They don't virtually question it. So what would you have to say to people that if somebody is in that place of that they're, if it's inside of me, then it's there for a reason, and it, I have my own best interest in mind. So, what I'm feeling must be sacred, must be useful, must be what why would I question it? What would you have to say to somebody that goes, yeah, that's what I feel, that's what I think, that's how I live my life, my reactions are my reactions, and they're, it's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. What would your input be?
That would be coming from someone who has a sense that everything is part of the same aspect of themselves. That they're not distinguishing between different aspects of themselves. They're not distinguishing between an ego or or other patterns or voices that could be present in their thinking.
What happens if they said, "So what? What's an ego?" I mean, I don't speak that much about that. I do speak about the ego, but I really just, because the ego is so complicated and vast and has so many different jobs, and there's positive parts in my mind and there's negative parts in my mind to what the ego does, is that I just say fear-based, the part of the ego that's fear-based. But that's not a common, we weren't taught that in school, and most people, no. and the people that were taught that in school, and most people's experience of when they talk about it, your average person, their knowledge of the ego really doesn't provide much utility, as far as I can tell. So what, like as a generalization, what would you say to somebody to say, I think there's a lot of people that are that don't really have much ability to be able to see that there's different voices. They don't even seem to be particularly curious a lot of the time. They just go, this is me, and I'm just going to do me.
Yeah, then I'd probably speak to something that they are experiencing, because if they're not experiencing that distinction or those nuances,
yes,
then I'd probably investigate their sense of separation from their experience, their sense of separation from others, their sense of separation from the world. Because if they're not distinguishing those different aspects, it's probably highly likely that they are being governed by them.
Yes.
Because if they're not able to
can't see them, you are going to be used by them.
You're used by them. So even something like the ego in its negative state, like you're saying, not in the positive, but in its negative form, will take certain things that they value and will turn it against them and use it as a form of separation, either making them feel better than or less than, or in some way separate from others. Or the ego is going to try and control every experience that they have rather than allowing them to have the experience, and therefore separate them from their experience, from their lives, from the world that they're living. So there'd be an experience of separation and a distance or numbing or not being part of their own lives. That in that way you could address that and say, well, okay, if you're not happy with that, then these are potentially some of the causes for it. Because I think this whole issue of separation and alienation is so widespread and becoming more and more because of people not addressing those nuanced.
I think that when you say separation, my entry point is usually pain and crises, and I have a fairly strong belief that human beings learn particularly about the negative parts of the ego through crises and through pain, and which you illustrate in, I think, is it fair to say that the separation that you're looking at and having them look at is virtually the pain they're experiencing?
Sure. Yeah.
So you also said something else that I keep forgetting about because I usually don't end up working with them, is the people that are in crises are the ones where their separation is causing pain in their life because there's things that they want that they're not getting, that they do feel the separation and it's painful for them in some kind of way, that they're not getting what they want out of life, and there's a saying about your ego's brought you down to your knees, and that's when people start looking at something being different. The other, I just want to, even if it's just briefly, is the people that are using the ego to be superior, and the ones that are particularly good at that, is that they don't really seem to get into crises. And I haven't had much experience of somebody that thinks their interpretation in life is, and how they always see everything is, that they're have a superior view, they're a superior person, they are making superior decisions. I don't really deal with that much. They don't really seem to come to crises.
But at some level, it would, or it must, because the thing is that that's not a sustainable situation. Because if the ego is functioning like that, and it is creating that kind of separation, and let's say it is predominantly using a sense of superiority or better than, then if that no longer becomes functional, it will use use the opposite. So it'll take those same values that somebody sees as being better than, and flip them around to create a situation where you come into contact with somebody who has more of those values or more of whatever it is that you are holding as being superior than, in order to create a lesser
somebody
situation.
with a balanced state of superiority and not good enough. That's kind of what you're pointing to. I think I was thinking more of, because I don't deal with that much. It's either normal people, like normal in the sense, but normal in the sense that they have a degree of not good enough, or just people that are just like trying. They have a fairly good outlook about self. They see themselves more or less, other than the normal everyday comparisons with other people, that person's a little bit better and this one's not. But I'm thinking more of the extremes. I very rarely deal with people that really aren't good enough, and usually there's a level of victim mentality that goes with that, which isn't easy to deal with. It's actually quite difficult to deal with. Or on the other side of things is the people that think they're superior. And I guess I was thinking more of kind of a manic form of it, or what's that called? Where they constantly are seeing themselves as in a better way. They're kind
sort of a delusional.
Yeah, they're bulletproof. Is what it is. So those are the two extremes. So I very rarely deal with those people that really see themselves as superior. I've never actually seen them crash into not being good enough. Do you have that? Have you been around that at all?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, definitely. Because in the sense, I think it's something that, if you're using a particular value or quality to somehow separate from others by making that a way of feeling better than other people, then it can just as easily flip into being less than. Okay. It's two sides of the same.
Yeah, I know.
Look, this is the way I see it: is that the ego is not interested in authenticity. The ego is interested in being accepted, in being approved of by others.
Yes.
So really it sort of promotes mediocrity in a way, because it goes for approval and acceptance and appraisal by others, which generally means you're striving for mediocrity, because authenticity is not going to put you necessarily in that realm of approval by others. No. So if you want to go for maximum approval, you're probably going to end up mediocre. So the ego, in a sense, is not promoting a real, authentic self, and it's not, and it's also trying to control experience, and experience is the means of accessing or getting to the authentic self.
Yeah, so with the mediocrity of being approved and being seen a particular way, you've already got an outcome in mind about how you want to be seen. You're virtually not really looking at self as what is my expression? What is the truth about me? Is that being, to the degree that you are roped in by, that you need to be accepted by the society, the people around you that are saying this is good and this is bad, which is really kind of a shame that we actually live that way, that we have I call it the cookie cutter, a list of things that you need to be and not be, or you're going to be judged by the world in some kind of way, so that you're not doing life right. And it really does, to the degree that you believe in that, and to the degree that your upbringing was that to get approval you needed to behave a certain way, is usually the people that have accepted that in some kind of way. And really it's at the cost of feeling, what am I, who am I, what's actually going on in there, what kind of human being, what is my true expression. And that a lot of people never really becomes overly important to them to be able to do that. There's really a sadness for that, for me, is that I just know how not interested I am in what people are supposed to look like, given that there's 7 billion people. They're all different. They all have a gift. They all need to be able to live their life in a particular way to learn what they need to learn in their journey of who they are. Nobody can predetermine that. If you're doing something, that's what you're supposed to be doing. That's what you're supposed to be learning. And there's lots of things in my life, for example, where I said, "Well, God, I'll never do that again." That didn't feel good. And 2 weeks later, I'm doing it again, one more time. Somehow I figured that I'd do it, and I go, God, okay, now I remember why I didn't do that. And, 4 weeks after that, I'm doing it yet another time. But that was the last time. I went, okay, now, I'm definitely not doing that again. So, and that's the process that you actually have to go through to be able to really figure out who you are and what your expression is and how the world works as opposed to how the world is supposed to work.